Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is sponsored by Hitachi America Limited. I'm Matt Reynolds, editor of Packaging World magazine, and I'll be your moderator. When you're trying to keep your packaging lines humming, you need all of your production line, including your inkjet coaters, to run efficiently. What if you had tools to maximize your inkjet equipment's performance? In this webinar, we'll learn 3 secrets to running your inkjet printer efficiently and review tips that can be applied to any inkjet equipment on your packaging line. Before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to let our audience members know that this webinar will be available for archived viewing at packagingworld.com within 48 hours of today's presentation. You'll receive notification when it's ready, and the slides will be available for download as well. Feel free to ask any questions at any time during the webinar by typing your question into the questions pane of the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll take some time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as time allows. So with us today is Christianchikva, Associate Project Manager for Marking and Coding at Hitachi America, a position he's held since 2017. Christian has a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry from Catawba College in North Carolina. His expertise in technical product management ensures that customer requirements are always met in every new generation of product innovation. So with that, why don't we get started? Christian, take it away.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. So I'll jump right into it and let everyone know about the 3 secrets that Hitachi America has for maintaining and keeping your inkjet printer as reliable as possible. So I would like to talk to you a little bit about a real life scenario. So in this scenario, we have a plant manager, Jim. He's recently been promoted to plant manager from working as a line operator. So in this specific food processing plant, they've been doing things the same way for a very long time. The previous plant manager had been there for years. Jim is new and he's motivated to make a name for himself by saving the company money. One way that he identifies he'll be able to save the company money is by making the line more efficient. When he's analyzing the line, he sees that inkjet printing is a huge proponent to downtime for his operation. So he wants to learn how can he keep the production line running more smoothly. And these are 3 tips that are going to help Jim bring his production line efficiency up to where it should be and help save his company money. So for secret number 1, it's all about startup. So I like to make an analogy. If you think about some sort of restaurant scenario, which many people would be familiar with, you have a shift of people that come in, work a shift, and at the evening they close down, and you assume that everything has been wiped down and cleaned and put away correctly. And then you have the next shift of people that come in and they've got to open everything up and get everything started. Production environments are no different. We run into trouble when the morning shift assumes that all of the work of the previous shift has been done appropriately, and then they decide to skip tasks that are critical to their operation for the day. So step number 1, you need to open up the print head of the printer, inspect it, see that it's been cleaned. Just verify that that work has been done when the printers were shut down. If you see any sort of dirt or debris, leftover ink residue, then you're going to want to move on to step 2, which is to clean the print head. The process for cleaning the print head is quite simple. Removing the print head cover, using a solution of solvent from the printer manufacturer, which will usually be stored on the line. Use that solvent to clean off any debris and any built up ink that may be left from the previous shift. And then you want to run a print test. There are a couple different ways to run a print test. One would be to take a piece of sample material, pull the print head off the line, and move that print head back and forth along the material and manually tell the printer to print. What you're looking for when you run a print test is any irregularity in your normal code. So the line operator that's performing this task should be familiar with what the code is supposed to look like. And they should also be trained on what specifically is going to indicate that there's some problem on the line. Some factors that they may look for would be dot scattering. So many people with inkjet experience know that it's a dot matrix style of printing. And that means that the nozzle ejects a very small dot of ink, and then the printer places that dot specifically where it wants it to go on the product. And for example, if we were writing the letter I or the number 1, you want to see a nice straight line. What you may see if there's some debris in the nozzle is just 1 or 2 of those dots may go astray, out of line. And as you write a whole message, you may see maybe it's just the dots towards the top. If you see any sort of pattern, that's particularly concerning and something that you're going to want to adjust and take 5 to 10 minutes before starting up your production line to save you downtime once production is up to full speed. So it's imperative to pay attention to the startup process, inspect and clean the print heads before they've been installed into the full production environment, and then run a print test. And you can either do that by pulling the printer offline and doing it off to the side, or quickly running a small batch of the product on the line itself. Running a batch on the line itself might be more difficult to do depending on your production environment, but it's going to give you a more realistic indication of whether or not your printer is ready to take on the day, so to speak. Are there any questions?
Yeah, actually, I had a question, and it seems like time could be saved by skipping the print test. I don't know, what is the reason for running one? Why is that important?
Absolutely, that's a great question, because you're right. The time it takes to inspect the print head and clean it could be less than a minute. Running a print test is the more time-consuming step that I talked about there. The reason you're going to want to do that is the print nozzle itself is measured in microns. A micron is a millionth of an inch. It's incredibly small. So all it takes is one tiny piece of dust or one small particle of dried ink to skew the print quality. And you're not going to know that from a visual inspection because the nozzle is so small. When the printer is running, you can inspect the ink stream, you can inspect the gutter visually, but unless you go all the way to the final step, which is conducting a print test and making sure that the dots are hitting the product the way that they should, you're not going to know any type of certainty that your printer is ready for production. And if you were to go into full production and there is some minuscule particle blocking that nozzle or having some effect on the electronic components or affecting the pneumatic components, any part of that system, if anything goes down during production, you're talking about downtime, and everybody who works in a manufacturing environment knows that downtime is the worst case scenario. It costs the company much more money in terms of taking a few minutes before your production is up to properly test versus spending an hour of downtime and possibly even having to rework product. Depending on your production environment, reworking product could be extremely cost prohibitive. So if there are no further questions, I'll move on to our next secret, which is common mistakes to avoid. So mistake number 1 is thinking that all fluids and inks are created equally. It is true that many continuous inkjet printers run off of inks that have similar chemical compositions, similar solvent types, similar dyes. That's absolutely true. But fluids are specifically designed and engineered from a chemical perspective to operate for a specific piece of equipment. Different pieces of equipment have different ways of controlling the physical parameters of that ink because the solvent tends to evaporate. Different printers have different ways of controlling that solvent evaporation and do it at different rates. So you can't simply add any ink into any printer. This is also it could lead to corrosion or premature part failure, nozzle clogging, like I was talking about previously. Using an ink that's not designed for a specific piece of equipment can be far more costly than any sort of fluid savings you think you may be making by trying to use a different fluid. It could lead to additional fluid consumption, cost of repair, downtime. It's almost never beneficial from a cost standpoint to use a fluid other than a manufacturer suggested fluid. Mistake number 2 is not knowing how to properly store your ink and fluid. So according to OSHA regulations, all solvents are flammable materials, and all flammable materials need to be kept in a flame-resistant cabinet, and they should all be in one secure location. So that's for the safety of everyone in your plant, but it's also to preserve the longevity of the ink. These cabinets are designed to keep the ambient temperature and humidity appropriate for storing your fluids. And that's going to help you not have to waste fluid if those fluids are not stored appropriately. Mistake number 3 is not wearing the proper protective equipment. A major reason that you're going to have to wear latex gloves and goggles is to protect yourself from the ink or the makeup fluid or solvent fluid contaminating your skin, but also vice versa, to prevent you from contaminating the product or the ink. If any of those contaminants get into the ink bottle or into the ink reservoir, then to touch back on point number 1, you're going to cause yourself downtime. That's ultimately going to be far more costly than just wearing the proper protective equipment. Another interesting point is there have been studies about people wearing PPE, and they did a study in a lab setting where some participants were asked to wear latex gloves, some participants were not. They actually found that participants wearing the proper equipment, wearing latex gloves and wearing protective goggles, were far more careful and paid closer attention to what they were doing in that environment than those who were not wearing the latex gloves. So it is highly recommended. It is also suggested by OSHA that PPE needs to be used while handling gloves. And it seems like an easy step to skip, but it could be a costly one if your ink becomes contaminated or if oils from your hands contaminate your product, and thus you can't have a high quality code that's going to stay and adhere to your product the way you want it to. Any questions on common mistakes in inkjet printing?
Yeah, Christian, is there a better place in the plant to place a chemical cabinet to store the fluids and inks?
Absolutely. So there should always be special care taken when you're thinking about where you might want to place your fluids. These fluids are chemically designed to be inert, which means that they're chemically designed not to react with anything around them or themselves. What can happen, and the reason that continuous inkjet inks actually have an expiration date, is typically because of the packaging that they're stored in. The packaging can degrade over time, especially if it's not kept in the proper environment. What I mean by the proper environment is just like a fine wine, a certain humidity, a certain temperature level is ideal for that packaging to not degrade over time. So you always want to find a cool, dry place within your environment that is also out of the way of moving equipment or anywhere where it could be disturbed. Because the last thing you want is for that cabinet to be damaged in any way, have any sort of chemical spill. So it's suggested that you find a room separate from the production environment that's a cool, dry place to put your fireproof cabinet, and that is going to help keep the packaging intact for a longer period of time and keep the customer from throwing away fluids unnecessarily. Because if you are to find that fluids aren't being stored properly, if they're being opened and then resealed and put back into a cabinet, that fluid is not going to work appropriately in the inkjet printer. Once it's opened, the entirety of the container should be put into the printer or put in a separate storage container that's intended for that. Solvents are a common example of this. Full solvent bottles, full ink bottles should always go in the cabinet. If you're using solvent for cleaning, there are specialized cleaning bottles that can be kept on a production floor, depending on your production environment and the official rules and regulations surrounding that. But there are certain solvent cleaning solution bottles that fluid can be transferred into, and that you should always take that precaution. So if there's no other questions, then I'll move on to our third and final secret, monitoring environmental conditions. So I mentioned this a little bit. It was a good lead in from the previous question. When you were talking about fluid storage, I talked about the packaging of the fluid a little bit, and that we don't want the packaging to grade because it could lead to contamination. But you also have to think about the environment that the printer is in. The printer itself is a very delicate piece of electronic equipment. You can think about it in many ways like a vehicle or like a desktop computer. It's a vehicle in the way that it does have robust, rigid components that are mechanical and made to move and rub against each other and not wear over time. But in another sense, it's also a delicate, highly calibrated piece of equipment that is susceptible to things like dust and vibration, especially in the electronics. So you have to do your best to keep the printer in a dry environment. The reason for that is these solvents tend to absorb moisture, and that moisture can't be removed from the solvent once it's been put into the printer. The only way to solve that problem if you have an extremely humid environment is to remove that ink and replace it with fresh ink if you do have humidity buildup and moisture buildup in your printer. The external printer environment, so moisture buildup within the printer would be an example of internal printer environment. External printer environment, I like to think of more as temperature, ambient temperature around the printer. Many manufacturers have equipment that puts off quite a bit of heat. If possible, you want to find a place on the production line where the printer is not going to be exposed to that level of heat, because the printer itself has to have a specific temperature at which the ink runs in order to create the dots for the message. So if a printer, I'll give an example of a more common fluid, it has an ambient temperature range of 0 degrees Fahrenheit to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not uncommon, especially for plants in southern US that might not be climate controlled, to exceed 100 degrees in certain areas of the plant by certain pieces of equipment. You're going to want to see if you can either mitigate that buildup of heat with some sort of cooling fan or blower. And if that may not be an option, then maybe you can move that printer to a different spot on the line where it's still able to mark the product, but it won't be affected by the heat being generated either from the environment or from the machinery itself. So the first 2 points are moisture and heat. The next one I like to talk about is being gentle with the print head. And what I mean by that is vibration. So the print head is the most delicate part of the entire system. It is there are different technologies for generating these drops, but basically they all overlap in that they use electronic components to oscillate an ink stream and create drops at 60 to 90,000 drops per second. And to try to visualize that, you have to know that that's an incredibly delicate system. And so if you have that print head mounted to a piece of machinery that's constantly vibrating, the machine itself, the printer itself, is fighting to make this extremely precise drop generation while being vibrated by an external component. Another form of vibration that you could think of is any sort of movement of that print head that might be unintentional, like banging the print head against a conveyor belt or having the print head drop on the ground or something like that nature. That can jolt these components in such a way that makes them misalign and you won't be able to print. And then along those lines, two of the things that I mentioned with the print head are vibration and dust. Anybody that works with electronics knows that those are the two worst things that you can expose electronics to. A buildup of dust can lead to a buildup of heat that will ultimately lower the lifetime, the life expectancy of those electronics. And then the vibration, as I was mentioning, that can lead to connections not being made and the product itself not performing the way that it should. So in order to make sure that you are mitigating the dust and the buildup of heat and the buildup of moisture, it's very important to change all of your filters. Within inkjet printing, most people that own printers know you have to replace the ink filter periodically, usually on some sort of preventative maintenance schedule, but it's often overlooked to replace cooling fan filters. And that replacing those cooling fan filters and making sure that the environment around your printer is in general clean as possible, then that is how you're going to ensure that those electronics and the fluid components are going to last as long as you expect them to. Do you have any questions about how to keep your environment?
Christian, well, I should mention, and this is partially an observation, but when you're talking about moisture, heat, dust, and vibration, that a lot of our audience, as in whether they're brands or CPGs, that's their production environment, whether upstream processing or in the packaging line. So that's all extremely important to keep to consider. And then there's always the human element. Operators in and around the facility, they're always a variable that's hard to control for. So I would ask you, are there things that manufacturers can do on the packaging line to help maintain that environment?
Absolutely. So one thing that an operator should always do is be aware of his surroundings. So oftentimes when you have an application engineer come in and install this equipment for the first time, special precautions are taken to mitigate the dust, vibration, heat, and other environmental factors that are going to affect it. The main thing that a production manager can do is train their operators to know what to look out for so that they can be observant. They're going to want to take note if one day there was a vortex blower on a printer and the next day there's not. Other things that they can do is not open doors to the outside that shouldn't be opened, or not introduce contaminants into the area that shouldn't be introduced. They should be aware of their production environment and be trained on how to keep it as clean and tidy as they can. And also to look for particular factors that could be contributing to printer downtime, things that may have changed from the previous production environment. Like, for example, let's say the print head was mounted on a floor stand, and now I see somebody's changed it because it was easier to mount it on the conveyor belt. Well, if somebody's changed that, an operator should take notice, maybe ask, is this supposed to be mounted this way, or should I put it back the way it was? Things like that. Operator training is very important in monitoring that production environment and making sure that it's appropriate for legible and high quality printing. Other things that you can do from a plant manager's perspective to help maintain that environment is you can work with your application engineers to take preventative measures. For example, if you're worried about dust, if you've got a particularly dusty environment, there are accessories that can be added to almost any inkjet printer that use factory air to prevent dust and contaminants from getting into the print head. I've talked about blowers, I've talked about cooling fans. You can use air pressure or an air knife to remove moisture from the environment. There's all sorts of different applications, and every production environment is so different. I would highly recommend taking preventative measures, and then on top of that, training your operators to make sure that they're following all of those steps so that the work you've done in preventing or creating a conducive environment for printing continues to operate the way that it's supposed to. We don't have any more questions on the production environment or monitoring the production environment. I'd like to just recap quickly on our 3 secrets that we're sharing with you on how to keep your inkjet printer running reliably. You want to make sure and maintain a consistent startup process that includes inspecting, cleaning, and testing your printer. Doing that every morning will save you downtime during your production. Be aware of common mistakes in terms of using PPE, making sure that you are storing your fluids and using manufacturer recommended fluids. And then you want to monitor the internal and external environment of the printer. You want to make sure that there's no buildup of dust or moisture inside the printer. You want to be aware of dust and ambient temperature around the printer and do all of the steps and processes that you can implement to control that as best you can. So the key takeaway is making a few simple changes can have a huge impact on your inkjet printer efficiency.
Thanks, Christian. That wraps things up nicely. And it brings us to the conclusion of today's webinar. If you'd like to learn more about anything discussed, as you can see, Christian's contact information is visible on the screen right now. And it'll also be available in the presentation itself when it becomes available and downloadable about 2 days from now. So we hope everybody found the topic informative, and we appreciate you for joining us today. We'll see you next time.